The morning they told us Vareth was gone, nobody cried. Not right away. We just stood there, in the shelter, beneath the flickering emergency strip lights that hummed like dying insects. We stood there and we looked at each other and nobody said a single word, because what do you even say when the second-to-last city on your planet stops transmitting? You don't say anything. You just breathe, and you wait, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a thought starts forming that you don't want to let fully arrive, the thought that says we're next. My name is Soren Mack. I was 31 years old when the Kadhari fleet arrived in our system. I was 33 when Vareth went dark. And I was 33 years, 4 months, and 11 days old when I saw something happen outside the walls of Thessavar that I will spend the rest of my life trying to explain to people who weren't there. This is that story. Let me back up. Let me go back to the beginning, because if I jump straight to the battle, you'll think I'm exaggerating. You'll think I'm one of those people who inflates things over time, who turns a skirmish into a war, a good decision into heroism, a lucky moment into a miracle. I'm not that person. I'm a logistics coordinator. I counted supply crates for a living. I tracked caloric intake across 12 shelter sectors and made sure that the water recyclers got their maintenance cycles on schedule. I am, by every possible measure, one of the least dramatic people who was present for what happened at Thessavar. Which is exactly why you should believe me. The Kadhari arrived in our system 17 months before the fall of Vareth. They didn't announce themselves. There was no transmission, no ultimatum, no formal declaration of conquest the way you see in old films. They just appeared. Our deep space relay stations picked up their entry signature at 3:40 System Standard Time on a Tuesday. By 600, we had a visual confirmation of fleet size. By 900, the Planetary Defense Council had convened. By noon, the word extinction was being used in official communications for the first time in our recorded history. There were 412 Kadhari warships in the initial fleet. The largest of them, a vessel we later named the Throne because we didn't know its actual designation, was roughly the size of a city block standing on its end. 3 kilometers of angular dark metal, bristling with weapons arrays and sensor grids, moving through our outer orbital approach with the patience of something that has done this many times before. And that was the thing that hit you, if you looked at the footage long enough. The patience. They didn't rush, they didn't scramble. There was no chaos on their end, no visible urgency. They moved into position the way you move furniture in a room you're about to redecorate, methodical, unhurried, confident. Our military scrambled 2 defense wings. 418 interceptors. The best we had, our pride, our shield. The machines we had built over a generation specifically for a threat like this. The Kadhari destroyed all 418 of them in 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Our pilots weren't bad. Our machines weren't outdated by our standards. We weren't ready for what the Kadhari actually were. We weren't ready for weapons that didn't behave like weapons we understood. We weren't ready for targeting systems that could calculate trajectory adjustments faster than our pilots could consciously register that they were being tracked. After the interceptors were gone, they sent a transmission. It was short. It was translated. We still don't fully understand how they had a working translation of our primary language, but they did. The transmission said, simply, "Surrender planetary administrative centers. Resistance classification, futile. Timeline for compliance, 72 hours." The Planetary Council deliberated for 4 hours before refusing. Looking back, that was probably the right call. Not because we had a real chance of winning. We didn't. Not then, but because surrender would have meant something different to the Kadhari than it means to us. We learned that later, from the ones who did surrender early on, from Pelavar and Drosset and the northern coastal settlements who opened their gates and put down their weapons and waited with hands raised. We learned what the Kadhari did with a cooperative population. Nobody talked about that much in the shelters, but we all knew. Over the next 8 months, they took the planet systematically. Not all at once, not in a great sweeping wave of destruction. That's not how the Kadhari operated, and understanding that is critical to understanding what eventually happened. They were surgeons, not blunderers. They isolated, they cut. They neutralized communications first, then power infrastructure, then military response capability. City by city, sector by sector. They were disassembling us the way you disassemble a machine, carefully, methodically, without wasted motion. Drosavar fell first, then Kelith. Then the eastern settlements in a cluster over about 3 weeks, Pran, Mivar, the old coastal cities of the Delavar Bay. Each one went the same way. A period of bombardment sufficient to collapse defensive capability. Then ground forces, the Kadhari infantry, which we'd barely seen in the early orbital engagements. Then silence. The silence was the worst part. After each city fell, we'd watch the communication feeds go dark one by one like lights being turned off in a building at night. Each one felt like a held breath that never got released. By the time Verath fell, we were the last significant population center left, Thessavar. Capital city, original planetary administrative hub, home to approximately 4 million survivors, including refugees from every other settlement that had been taken or destroyed. 4 million people, huddled inside walls and shields and whatever we had left waiting. The council had a name for what they were building in those final months. They called it the Omega Protocol. I called it desperate hope, wrapped in engineering language. They weren't wrong to try. I don't want to be cynical about it. The engineers who worked on Omega Protocol were brilliant people working under impossible conditions with inadequate resources. They took everything we had left, the remaining energy weapon platforms, the ground-to-orbit railgun batteries, the shield generators that had been pulled from every non-essential installation on the planet, and they integrated it into a unified defense network centered on Thessavar. The idea was layered defense, multiple overlapping systems, each compensating for the weaknesses of the others, kinetic interceptors for the initial approach, energy barriers for close-range bombardment, suppression fields to scramble the Kadhari targeting systems, at least temporarily. And at the center of it all, the Thessavar core, a directed energy weapon of genuinely impressive scale that had been the planetary government's most closely guarded military project for 15 years. On paper, the Omega Protocol could theoretically hold the Kadhari at bay for an extended period. On paper. But I was in logistics. I saw the actual numbers, and the actual numbers told a different story. The shield generators were running at 63% of rated capacity, and that was on a good day. The kinetic interceptors were short on ammunition. We'd burned through reserves in the early engagements before we understood how little difference they made. The Thessavar core was operational, but the power requirements were staggering, and our grid was already strained. We had maybe 3 weeks, maybe 4 if we were lucky, if the Kadhari were cautious, if everything held together. We all knew this. We just didn't say it. The Kadhari fleet appeared over Thessavar on a morning in late autumn, which I realize is an absurd detail to include, but I remember it clearly. I remember because the season meant the sky was this specific shade of gray-orange when they arrived, and the light through the shelter's observation port made everyone's faces look strange, like we were underwater. I was in Sector 7's distribution hub when the proximity alert went off. It wasn't the first time we'd heard it. We'd had 3 false alarms in the past month as Kadhari scout vessels swept over the city. But this time, the alert had a different tone, a sustained double pulse rather than the standard single. Double pulse meant confirmed engagement scale force. Someone in the hub, I don't know who, I never found out, said "Oh no" very quietly. And then everything started moving very fast. I made my way to the civilian observation post on level 9, which is where I was technically supposed to report during a general alert. The post was a repurposed office with a series of feed screens showing external cameras, defense system status boards, and the tactical overlay from command. There were about 40 of us crammed into that room. I pushed my way to a spot near the window, an actual window, which was probably not ideal for safety, but none of us were thinking about ideal safety at that moment. I looked up through the scratched permaplex and I saw them. The Kadhari fleet. Even now, even after everything, it's difficult to describe how they looked. The scale of them. The human mind isn't built to properly process objects that size in the atmosphere. The 3 largest ships, the Throne and 2 vessels we'd named Apex and Meridian, had descended into low atmosphere and were moving into position over the city like 3 weather systems deciding where to rain. They weren't firing yet. That was the thing that made your stomach drop. They weren't firing yet, and somehow that was worse than if they had been. They were just watching. Like they wanted us to have a moment to appreciate what was coming. The council broadcast a message citywide at 7:48. I heard it through the speaker above the doorway in the observation post, through a burst of static, and then the voice of Administrator Yenna, who had been running the city's emergency government for the past 6 months. She had a steady voice, Yenna, the kind that didn't crack under pressure. I'd seen her speak in the early days of the siege, when people were scared and confused and angry, and she'd always managed to sound like someone who was in control of the situation even when she very clearly wasn't. She didn't sound that way now. She sounded like someone saying goodbye. "Citizens of Thessavar," she said, "the Kadhari fleet has assumed bombardment positioning over our coordinates. The Omega Protocol is now active. Our defense teams are prepared. Our engineers are at their stations. Every person in this city who has worked, contributed, endured, I see you. I am with you. Whatever happens today, we faced it together." She paused. "Thessavar will not surrender." The room was quiet for a moment after the broadcast ended. Then someone said good, and someone else laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughing was the only thing left. The first barrage hit at 8:03. I felt it before I heard it, this deep thrumming vibration that moved up through the floor into my feet and legs, like the building was trying to shake itself apart. Then the sound arrived, a sustained cracking roar that rattled the permaplex in its frame and made my ears ring even through the building's soundproofing. The shields held. That first barrage, the Kadhari were testing range and intensity, probing for weaknesses in the defensive network. The Omega Protocol's outer defense layer absorbed the energy, converted what it could, dispersed the rest. The city shook. Alarms screamed through every speaker system, but the walls held. The feeds in our observation post showed the tactical overlay. Defense status: green across most sectors, amber in 2. The kinetic interceptors were tracking 3 waves of Kadhari fighter-class vessels that had peeled off from the main fleet and were making attack runs on the outer shield emitters. Our ground-based anti-fighter batteries opened up. I could hear them, a different sound from the shield impacts, sharper and more rhythmic, like hailstones on metal at astronomical scale. For about 20 minutes, it looked like the Omega Protocol might actually work. And then Apex brought its main weapons array online. I can't fully describe what it looked like when Apex fired its primary battery for the first time. The tactical overlay showed a power spike reading that literally broke the display. The indicator bar went past maximum, and then the display froze for 3 seconds while the system tried to process numbers it wasn't designed to handle. What I saw through the window was a column of something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite matter. A thick, concentrated stream of energy that connected the underside of Apex to the outer shield ring of Thessavar like a bridge between 2 points. The outer shield ring lasted approximately 9 seconds. When it collapsed, the sound was enormous, a deep thwump that pressed against my chest like a physical thing, followed by a cascade of smaller sounds as 3 shield emitter towers vaporized simultaneously. The tactical overlay shifted from green to yellow to amber across half the city sectors in about 4 seconds. Someone in the room said they're through. Someone else said not all the way through. They were both right. The outer ring was gone, but the inner shield network was still holding. The Thesavar core fired for the first time, a brilliant white line climbing from the center of the city straight up into the underbelly of Apex, and for one perfect moment, something happened that nobody expected. Apex flinched. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but it moved. The enormous ship shifted its angle by perhaps 3 degrees, an almost imperceptible adjustment for something that size, but we could see it on the overlay. A cheer went up in the observation post. I understood the cheer. I felt it in my own chest too, that sudden rush of it's actually working. But I was also watching the overlay numbers. And the overlay numbers were telling me that the core had consumed nearly 18% of our total reserve energy with that single shot. We had maybe 5 or 6 shots left. I didn't say anything. None of us were there to make strategic decisions. We were logistics coordinators and admin staff and medical support personnel. We were not the people with power in that room. We just watched. The battle lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. I'm going to be honest about how I experienced it, which is to say, I experienced most of it in fragments, in short, clear moments interrupted by terror and noise, and the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained fear. If you've ever been in a situation where you were genuinely afraid for an extended period, you know what I mean. Your brain doesn't record it linearly. It records the significant things, the loud sounds, the sudden shocks, the faces of the people around you, and compresses everything else. What I remember in sequence. The second barrage, which hit 2 sectors over from ours and brought part of a transit corridor down. I remember the sound of that, which was different from the shield impact sounds, lower, more final. A woman named Tress, who was a water systems technician, holding a younger colleague's hand and talking to him quietly while he shook. I don't know what she was saying. Whatever it was, it worked. The moment when the inner shield in Sector 12 collapsed, and the tactical overlay showed a gap in our coverage that the Kadhari immediately began exploiting. The core firing again, 4 more times in about 90 minutes. 4 brilliant lines of white energy climbing into the sky. Apex taking visible structural damage on its forward section. The fleet adjusting their formation in response, spreading out, making themselves harder targets. And then the power grid starting to fail. It started in the outer sectors, which made tactical sense. The Kadhari had identified the grid relay stations as priority targets and had been hitting them methodically throughout the battle. One by one, sector by sector, the power readings on our overlay began to drop. When the grid fails, everything fails. That's the brutal arithmetic of an energy-dependent defense system. The shields need power. The weapons batteries need power. The core, especially the core, needs power. By hour 3, we were running on emergency reserve. By hour 3.5, Administrator Yena's voice came back over the speaker. She didn't broadcast citywide this time. This was a command channel message that we received in the observation post because we were technically an auxiliary command facility. Core power at 12%, she said. Her voice was steady, but something in it had changed. Something had gone quiet. Shield coverage at 31%. We have 1 core shot remaining, possibly 2. The Council is deliberating on deployment. A pause. I need everyone to hold their positions. Another pause, longer. I'm sorry, she said. I need everyone to know I'm sorry. The room got very still. I'm going to tell you something that I haven't told many people. because it seems small against the scale of everything else. But this is the moment I want you to understand, the moment that makes the rest of the story land the way it should. When Yenna said I'm sorry, I looked around the room at the 40-something people in that observation post, and I saw something I wasn't expecting. I saw calm. Not the numb, frozen calm of shock, not the artificial calm of denial, the real kind. The kind that sits in your chest like a stone that's been there so long it's become part of the foundation. These people, these exhausted, frightened, underfed, overworked people who had been living under siege conditions for months, these people had already made their peace with the possibility of this moment. They had already done the internal work of it. They weren't ready to die. Nobody is ever really ready, but they had stopped fighting the idea of it. And there was something almost unbearable about how dignified that was. I remember thinking, we deserved better than this. Not because we were special, not because our species was exceptional or remarkable in the galaxy's scheme. Just because everyone who tries, everyone who builds something and loves someone and shows up and keeps going, they deserve better than to be methodically dismantled by something that doesn't even see them as people. We deserved better. And then the signal hit our comm systems. I almost missed it. I was looking at the woman named Tress, still holding her colleague's hand, both of them watching the feeds. I was thinking about the stone in the chest thing, about comm, about what it means to keep going. And then one of the communication technicians in our post, a young man named Arvith, 22 years old, perpetually worried expression, the kind of person who triple-checked everything. Arvith made a sound I'd never heard from him before. He made a sound like all the air had left his body at once. I turned to look at him. He was staring at his communication console. His hands were on the edges of it, gripping it, and his face had done something that faces don't usually do. It had sort of opened, like a door. "What?" I said, not as a question, as a sound. "There's a signal," he said, "incoming from," he shook his head slowly, "from outside the system." The room went quiet, people turned. "Who is it?" someone asked. Arvith looked up. His eyes were doing something strange. It took me a second to realize what it was. He was trying not to cry. "It's human," he said. I should explain what human meant to us at that point. About 4 years before the Kedhari arrived, our exploration vessels had made contact with a species from a distant system. They called themselves humans. They were bipedal, oxygen-breathing, biologically not entirely different from us in the broad-stroke sense, though the specific details varied considerably. They had 2 eyes, bilateral symmetry, a biochemistry that processed water and carbon in familiar ways. They were also, by every civilizational metric we had, significantly behind us. Their technology was younger. Their interstellar travel was newer. They had a single homeworld and a small number of established colonies, while we had been a spacefaring civilization for over 300 years. When the Kadhari came, we'd had limited contact with humans over those 4 years. Diplomatic exchanges primarily, some scientific and trade discussions. We knew them, but we didn't know them well. And we certainly hadn't asked them for help. In fact, the Council had specifically debated this in the early stages of the Kadhari campaign, and had decided against requesting human assistance on the grounds that there was nothing they could meaningfully offer. Their weapons technology wasn't as developed as ours, and ours hadn't been sufficient. Their fleet was smaller. Their military experience in interstellar conflict was essentially non-existent. The Council had decided that asking the humans for help would be inviting them to die alongside us. Nobody had told the humans this, apparently. The signal was a transmission from a ship, one ship. Arvith put it on the main feed, and we saw the external camera footage a moment later, because the ship was close enough to be caught by our outer sensor arrays. It was a human vessel. That was clear from the design signature. Humans build their ships differently from us. with a certain kind of angular practicality that our engineers always found slightly inelegant but undeniably functional. This one was large, larger than any human vessel I'd seen in the diplomatic footage. And it was not alone. Behind the first ship, emerging from the transit point at the edge of our system, came more. 1, then 5, then 12. Then I lost count, because the sensor array started having trouble processing the number of emergent signatures, and Arvith was talking over the feed, reading off the numbers as they came in, and his voice had gone strange and high. 40 vessels, he said, 60, 80, 100, and he stopped. Command is getting this too. Command is they're saying. He stopped again. How many? I asked. He looked at me. 214, he said. Human vessels, 214, and there. He looked back at his console, reading something. They're hailing the Kadhari fleet. The hail was on a broadcast frequency. We could hear it. The voice was human, obviously human, once you knew what to listen for. There was a particular quality to human vocal production, something in the resonance that our species doesn't fully replicate. It was a woman's voice, measured and clear, speaking in a translation standard language that both we and the Kadhari used for interspecies communication. She said, "This is Admiral Constance Varro of the Terran Expeditionary Command, speaking to the commander of the Kadhari fleet currently engaged over Thessavar. You are in violation of the Galactic Compact's Article 7 prohibitions on non-consensual population displacement. You are ordered to withdraw from this system immediately. This is your only warning." The room was completely silent. Somewhere outside, a secondary blast hit the city and the building shuddered. Nobody looked away from the feed. The Kadhari response came about 90 seconds later, also on broadcast frequency, also translated. "Human vessels, you are outclassed. This engagement does not concern your species. Withdraw or be destroyed." A pause brief. Then Admiral Varro again. "We've heard that before," she said. And the human fleet opened fire. I want to be careful here, because I know how this part of the story can sound. I know it can sound like hyperbole, like the kind of thing that gets inflated in the retelling until the reality is buried under mythology. So let me try to tell you what I actually saw on those feeds, what the sensors actually recorded, what happened over Thessavar in the next 90 minutes as accurately as I can reconstruct it. The human fleet came in fast. Faster than any vessel of that size should have been able to move through an active engagement zone. The tactical overlay, which had been showing us our own collapsing defense situation in grim amber and red, suddenly had 200 new contacts on it, and they were moving with a kind of coordinated aggression that made the air in the observation post taste different. The Kadhari fleet, to their credit, responded with discipline. They had the numbers advantage, 412 ships to 214. They had the firepower advantage, or so they believed. They reorganized their formation with efficient speed, diverting a significant portion of their fleet away from the Thessavar bombardment and toward the incoming human force. This was, as it turned out, a mistake. Not because human weapons were superior to Kadhari weapons. They weren't, not individually. Not because human shields were stronger, they weren't, not by the specs we later analyzed. It was a mistake for a different reason, a reason that took me a long time to fully understand, but that I think I understand now. The humans had read the Kadhari. They had watched. They had studied the footage of the Kadhari's campaign against us. They had analyzed 8 months of engagement data, the methodical isolations, the systematic dismantling, the patient methodical approach that had proven so devastatingly effective against our own forces. And they had built their entire battle plan around exploiting exactly what made the Kadhari so effective. The Kadhari fought like surgeons, as I said. Precise, calculated, efficient, Every move served the objective, nothing wasted. Humans, apparently, do not fight like surgeons. The human fleet came in 3 waves, which isn't unusual tactically, except that the 3 waves weren't doing the same thing. The first wave, the Vanguard 40 ships, drove straight into the Kadhari formation's left flank at what I can only describe as uncomfortable speed. They weren't in tight formation. They were scattered, irregular, each ship apparently operating with significant individual autonomy. The Kadhari targeted them efficiently. They destroyed 11 ships in the first 4 minutes. By their doctrine, by their metrics, they were doing well. But those 11 ships, as they were destroyed, didn't simply stop. They kept moving. 3 of them used their final seconds of operational control to push their trajectories into the paths of Kadhari vessels, forcing emergency maneuvers. The other 8, and this is the part that made the tactical analysts later call it characteristically human, the other 8 had apparently rigged some kind of improvised kinetic dispersal system in their cargo holds, so that when they died, they scattered a debris field across approximately 40 cubic kilometers of space. It was, strategically speaking, a mess. The Kadhari, who preferred precision, did not like mess. The second wave, 80 ships, hit the right flank at the same moment. The debris field from the first wave's losses started complicating the Kadhari targeting picture. And the second wave was doing something nobody had seen the Kadhari face before. They were broadcasting on Kadhari military frequencies. Jamming, but not passive jamming, active jamming, signal mimicry, making the Kadhari formation's own communication system give false orders, false positions, false targeting data. We found out later that a small team of human cryptographers had spent 3 months working with captured Kadhari communication fragments from our early engagements to build that mimicry system. 3 months, for a battle that might last 3 hours. The Kadhari fleet began to show something we had never seen from them. Hesitation. Small hesitation. Brief moments where the precise, coordinated responses slowed by half a second, where individual vessels seemed to be waiting for confirmation before moving, where the smooth, surgical dance of their formation developed stutters. Half a second doesn't sound like much. In a space battle, half a second is everything. The third wave hit the throne. The largest ship, the flagship, the vessel that had been hanging over Thessavar like a permanent threat throughout the entire battle, too large and too central to the Kadhari formation for any of our remaining weapons to seriously target. 94 human ships hit the throne simultaneously. Not all at once, exactly. They came in from 7 different approach vectors, coordinated but staggered so that the throne's point defense systems couldn't concentrate fire on any single axis. It was like watching someone try to put out 7 fires in 7 different rooms at the same time. The throne was built to take punishment. It did. It was still operational at the end. I want to be clear about that. I don't want to exaggerate. The throne was not destroyed. The throne was, however, no longer focused on us. And somewhere in the middle of that assault on the flagship, with the left flank disrupted and the right flank tangled in signal chaos, and the command vessel under assault from 94 simultaneous attackers, the Kadhari made a decision. They began to withdraw. Not flee, I want to be precise about this too. The Kadhari retreat was as disciplined as everything else they did, organized, controlled, covering their withdrawing elements with suppressive fire. But they were retreating. They were pulling back from Thessavar, pulling back from our system, reassembling in higher orbit. And as they withdrew, the human fleet followed. Not aggressively, they didn't chase the Kadhari toward the system edge. They just stayed between, positioned themselves between the Kadhari fleet and the planet, a wall. 214 ships. They'd lost 31 by this point. I checked the numbers later, standing between what was left of us and the thing that had been taking everything. The bombardment stopped. I think the moment the bombardment stopped was the moment it became real for people in the observation post. Not when the human fleet appeared, not when the battle turned. When the bombardment stopped, and the building stopped shaking, and the alarms went from continuous to intermittent to, after about 3 minutes, nothing. The silence was, I don't have the right word for it. It was enormous. It was the silence of a sound that had been so constant for so long that you'd stopped consciously hearing it, and now that it was gone, you realized how heavy it had been. Someone in the observation post started crying, quietly with their face turned toward the wall, a private thing. I stood at my window and watched the feeds and felt nothing for about 2 full minutes, just blank. Like the volume on all my internal states had been turned down to 0. Then it came back. It came back all at once, the way those things do. Huge and comprehensive and not entirely comfortable. Not just relief, also grief, because Verath was still gone, all the other cities were still gone, 3 months of siege were still real, and everything we'd lost in those months was still lost. Relief and grief together, which I've learned is a combination that hits differently than either one alone. I put my hand on the permaplex of the window, just to have something solid. Outside, through the scratched, impact-starred permaplex, I could see the sky beginning to clear. The bombardment's atmospheric effects, the particulate haze, the electrical disturbance were starting to dissipate. The gray-orange light of late autumn was coming back. Above it all, barely visible but there if you knew where to look, the human fleet. 214 ships, minus 31 holding position. They came, Arvith said. He was standing behind me. I hadn't heard him get up from his console. They came, I agreed. Administrator Yenna made a broadcast at 1347. Her voice had changed again. The goodbye quality was gone. What was there instead was something harder to name. Something that sounded like someone standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering that the cliff isn't the edge of the world, that the world keeps going, and so do you. Thesavar stands, she said. That was the whole broadcast, 3 words. But she let them sit there in the air for a long moment before the channel closed, and in that moment, those 3 words had the weight of everything. I'll tell you one more thing about part 1, before I move to what came after. That evening, as the emergency crews were beginning to assess damage and the medical teams were spreading through the sectors, I went up to the roof of our building. It wasn't exactly permitted. The structure integrity assessment wasn't complete, but I needed to be outside, or as close to outside as I could manage. From the roof I could see the city. Parts of it were dark where the grid was still down. Parts of it were lit in emergency amber. One sector to the northeast showed the glow of fires that were being brought under control. It was not a pretty sight. Thesavar had taken serious damage. There would be a great deal of rebuilding ahead, and that was assuming the Kadhari didn't simply wait us out, which was a real possibility. But I could also see, if I looked directly up, the pinpoints of light that were the human fleet, moving slowly against the stars, arranged in a pattern that I would later learn was a standard defensive perimeter, designed to cover the maximum approach vectors with the minimum force. They were still there. They'd come, they'd fought, they'd stayed. I sat on the roof for a long time. The autumn air was cold in a way that felt clean. Below me, the city was beginning slowly to exhale. Part 2, what the humans brought with them. 6 days after the battle, I met Admiral Constance Varro for the first time. Not in any official capacity. I was logistics. The official meetings between the Terran Expeditionary Command and the Thesavar Administrative Council happened in the government complex across the city, in rooms I had no access to. I know what was discussed in those meetings only from what was later made public, and from what people told me afterward. What I can tell you about from direct experience is the supply coordination. 214 ships, minus 31 lost in the battle, -4 more that had sustained damage severe enough to require evacuation, means approximately 179 operational human vessels sitting in defensive orbit around our planet. 179 ships means tens of thousands of personnel. Tens of thousands of personnel means food, water, medical supplies, equipment maintenance, waste management, communication infrastructure, and about 300 other logistical concerns that needed to be coordinated with the groundside systems I was responsible for. In other words, Admiral Varro came to me. Or rather, she sent her chief logistics officer, a colonel named Petra Halst, who arrived at my distribution hub on the morning of day 3 with a datapad full of supply manifests and an expression that said she dealt with worse situations and intended to deal with this one efficiently. We got along immediately. Petra Halst was the person who actually explained to me what had happened. Not in the broad strokes political sense. I understood that the humans had come to help us, that they'd done so without being asked, that the galactic political implications were complex and ongoing. What Petra explained to me was the how, the mechanics of it. "How did you know?" I asked her on day 4, when we'd established enough logistical groundwork that we could have an actual conversation. "How did you know to come? We didn't send a request." Petra was a compact woman with short dark hair, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent a long time on ships where standing up straight was a practical necessity. She had a habit of tapping her forefinger against the surface she was working at when she was thinking, a small, unconscious rhythmic thing that I found oddly reassuring. "Tab, tab, tab. We've been watching," she said simply. "Watching. Your system has monitoring beacons, did you know that? Your own, from about 90 years back, placed along the outer orbital approaches. Low-power passive sensors mostly. I don't think your current government even knew they were there, honestly. Our survey teams found them about 8 months before the Kadhari arrived. Tap, tap. We've been receiving the data they collected since then, including everything from the engagement." "So you saw the whole thing?" "We saw everything." A pause. "Then why did it take this long?" I asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "If you saw everything from the beginning, why?" "Politics," she said. The word landed flat and heavy like she dropped it. "There were people who said it wasn't our fight, that we were still a young species, that we shouldn't be putting ourselves in the path of a Kadhari fleet, that we didn't have the weapons, that we didn't have the numbers." Tap. "Those arguments weren't wrong, by the way. We don't have better weapons than the Kadhari. We didn't have enough ships. We still don't, really. But you came anyway." She looked at me. Her expression was interesting. It wasn't the kind of look that was performing anything, not pride, not modesty, not the self-consciousness of someone who knows they're being asked to be a hero. It was just honest. "The Admiral made the case," she said. "Varro, she went in front of the Terran Council and she said, look, we can stand here and calculate whether we have the firepower to win this fight. We can run the numbers. We can build the models. And the models will probably say it's too dangerous because the models are good at identifying risk and bad at identifying what you lose by doing nothing." She paused. "Or we can remember what we're for." "What you're for," I repeated. She said, "If we build ships and we fill them with weapons and we train soldiers and we go out into the galaxy and we can't find it in ourselves to use any of that when someone needs it, what exactly were we building all of it for?" The room was quiet for a moment. I thought about Yenna saying "I'm sorry" over the command channel. I thought about Tress holding her colleague's hand. I thought about 40 people in an observation post making their peace with a stone in the chest. "What happened?" I asked, after she said that. Petra smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind you wear when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you're just now starting to put it down. "They voted," she said, "and then we built the fleet. I want to talk about the humans. Not the tactical picture, not the political maneuvering. I want to talk about the actual people, because I think that's the part that doesn't make it into the official accounts. In the weeks after the battle, as the Kadhari fleet maintained its position at the system's edge, not withdrawing, but not attacking either, apparently reassessing, regrouping, trying to determine what had happened and what it meant, the human personnel who came down to the surface to assist with repair and supply efforts were present in Thesavar in significant numbers. They were strange. I mean that with complete respect. They were strange in ways that were fascinating to observe. They were louder than we are as a species in the casual social sense, not aggressive loud, expressive loud. They responded to things with their whole faces, their whole bodies. A piece of good news would produce visible, immediate, unguarded reactions, laughter, exclamations, spontaneous arm movements that I eventually recognized as celebratory gestures. A piece of bad news would produce something just as visible and direct. They didn't modulate their emotional expression the way we tend to, didn't manage it down into something more controlled and socially acceptable. At first, some of our people found this unsettling. We're a culture that values composure. Visible emotion of the kind the humans displayed freely is in our tradition considered something to manage privately, not broadcast. But after a while, after a week of living alongside them in the shared space of a city that was piecing itself back together, after a while, something shifted. I watched a human engineer named Dev spend 3 hours helping a family in Sector 4 dig out a section of collapsed corridor to retrieve a box of personal belongings that the family had left behind when they evacuated. 3 hours for a box. There was no logistical reason for it, no official directive. He just helped, completely, without reservation. When they finally got the box out, and the family saw that it had survived intact, the mother started crying. And Dav, this large, broad-shouldered human engineer who I'd only seen in the context of repair assessments and equipment inventory, Dav's face did the thing where it opened like a door, and he put his hand briefly on the woman's shoulder and said something quietly. I wasn't close enough to hear it. But the woman nodded. And whatever he'd said, she held on to it. I met Admiral Varro on day 6 because of a supply chain dispute. The Terran fleet's primary logistics officer, Petra's supervisor, a man named Commander Ashok, had authorized a diversion of approximately 400 units of their medical polymer compound to our civilian trauma centers, which were overwhelmed. A good call, practically speaking. The humans had surplus, we had critical need. But the authorization had gone through without the proper bilateral approval chain, which had caused a bureaucratic problem with our council's supply committee, which had escalated to the point where the humans' chain of command wanted to address it at a higher level. Which meant Admiral Varro came to the distribution hub. She walked in with 2 aides and Petra, and she was smaller than I'd expected from the voice on the broadcast. Not small exactly, but compact, the same way Petra was compact. I later learned this was partly a function of spending significant time in space environments, where certain body type considerations become practical. She had a face that showed her age, probably mid-50s by human standards, though I wasn't fully calibrated on what that looked like, and eyes that were doing several things simultaneously, which I gathered was standard operating mode for her. She looked around my distribution hub with the expression of someone cataloging everything, without appearing to catalog anything. "You're Soren Mack," she said. "I am," I said. "You keep the water recyclers on schedule." I blinked, yes. "Extremely important," she said, without any irony, and the thing is, she meant it. In a siege situation, water recycler maintenance is a direct casualty prevention function. You probably kept people alive. I had never thought about it in those terms. I had thought about it as a job, as a schedule, as the thing I was responsible for because someone had to be. The supply chain dispute," I said, because I wasn't sure what else to say. She waved a hand. Ashok was right to divert the polymers. The approval chain was a formality we'll correct going forward. That's not why I wanted to come down. Why did you want to come down? She looked at me for a moment. The way she looked at things was a full attention look, the kind that makes you want to say something worth listening to. I wanted to see it, she said. See the hub. See the city. See what you built here, what you maintained. A pause. We watched the engagement data, but that's not the same as seeing it. Numbers don't tell you what it costs, what it takes to keep 4 million people functional when someone is systematically trying to end you. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe a thing that is hard but real, without dramatics. It costs a lot, I said. It always does, she said. And then, almost as an afterthought, it was worth coming. 3 things happened in the 3 weeks after the battle that I want to tell you about, because they matter to the shape of what came after. The first was the Kadhari communication. On day 9, the Kadhari fleet sent a transmission directly to the Terran Fleet Command, not to us, to the humans. It was on a frequency that our communication systems could receive but wasn't addressed to us, and we received it because Arvith, who was monitoring every frequency with the obsessive thoroughness that was characteristic of him, caught it and recorded it. The transmission was longer than any previous Kadhari communication I was aware of. It was also, unlike previous communications, in the Kadhari's own language, with a human language translation appended, as if they'd prepared it knowing the humans would be the audience. I don't have the full text. What was shared with us was a summary, via Petra, of the relevant portions. The relevant portions were, the Kadhari wanted to talk, not to negotiate surrender, not to offer terms for our withdrawal, not any of the things we might have expected based on their previous communications, which had always been more ultimatum than conversation. They wanted to talk to the humans. About us, apparently, about the engagement, about why the humans had come. The Council of Thesavar had a tense 3-day discussion about this, during which I was not present but which I was briefed on afterward. The core anxiety was, what were the humans going to say? They had come to help us, yes, but they were now in direct communication with the species that had nearly destroyed us, and we had no formal alliance, no treaty, no guarantee of what Terran interests would look like in a longer negotiation context. Varro addressed this directly in a joint session with our council. She came in and sat down and said, before anyone could ask their most worried question, "We came here because it was right. We're not changing the story now." And then she said something else, which I was told by 2 different people who were in the room and which I've thought about many times since. She said, "The Kadhari are going to ask us why humans care what happens to your species. They're going to ask what our strategic interest is. And the honest answer is that the strategic interest is human, not strategic. We don't want to live in a galaxy where this is what happens and nobody does anything. That's the whole interest." The second thing was the memorial. On day 14, Thesavar held a memorial for the dead, not just from the final battle, from the entire 8 months. From everyone who was in the cities that fell, everyone who didn't make it to Thesavar, everyone who had died inside the walls during the siege. The number was large. I'm not going to put it here, because it belongs to the people it represents, and numbers on a page don't do justice to that. The memorial was held in the main plaza of the administrative district, which had been partially damaged in the battle but had been structurally cleared. There was a speaker platform. There were representatives of every sector, every surviving community, every group that had endured the siege. Administrator Yenna spoke. She said what needed to be said, and she said it without flinching, which was what was needed. What I want to tell you about is what happened at the end of the memorial. The humans came. Nobody had formally invited them, or rather, the invitation had been extended as a courtesy. The way you extend an invitation when you don't expect the other party to be able to attend. But they came. Not all of them, not thousands, about 200 personnel who were groundside at the time, along with Admiral Varro and her immediate staff. They stood at the edge of the plaza. They didn't push forward. They didn't try to take up space. They just stood there in their fleet uniforms in the mid-autumn light. And when Yenna's final words were done, and the silence that follows a memorial settled over the plaza, that particular heavy silence, the humans were quiet too. One of them, I don't know who, started humming, quietly, a slow, low melody. And then others joined, not singing, humming, just the sound of it spreading through those 200 people. I later learned it was a human mourning tradition. When words aren't enough, they fill the silence with sound instead. I don't know how to describe what that did to the people in the plaza. I can tell you that Yenna, who had been steady through everything, through the whole siege, through the battle and the broadcasts, and the 4 months of methodical loss, Yenna covered her face with her hands and wept. And I think the city wept with her. The third thing was the conversation I had with Admiral Varro on the roof of my building. This was day 18. The logistical coordination between the fleet and our city systems had reached a stable rhythm, and I had some actual sleep under my belt for the first time in weeks, and I was sitting on the roof in the early morning before my shift started, drinking something warm that was approximately coffee, watching the sky. I heard footsteps on the access ladder, slow, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who isn't sure the roof is fully cleared for weight bearing, but is going up anyway. And then Varro emerged from the access hatch. She was off duty, or as close to it as someone like her gets. No aides. She was carrying her own version of something approximately coffee, and she looked like she'd been up for a while. She sat down a reasonable distance from me, not intrusive. Just the roof, early morning, 2 people watching the sky. We sat quietly for a few minutes. Below us, the city was beginning to wake up. You could hear it, the sounds of a city resuming its own rhythms after a long forced pause. The Kadhari talks are progressing, she said eventually. I've heard some of it. It's complicated. A pause. They're not, I want to say something carefully here because I've gotten in trouble for oversimplifying this. They're not evil, the Kadhari. They're operating within a logic that makes complete sense within their own framework. Expansion, resource acquisition, efficiency. In their framework, what they did here was not wrong, just necessary. That's not comforting. I know, she took a drink. What I'm saying is, changing their behavior isn't about making them feel guilty. It's about changing what's possible, about introducing factors they hadn't calculated for. She looked out at the sky. We were a factor they hadn't calculated for. Humans, I said. Humans, she agreed. A comfortable silence. Can I ask you something? I said. Go ahead. Were you afraid during the battle? She thought about this. Actually thought about it, rather than giving the reflexive answer that someone in her position might be expected to give. Yes, she said, but not of the Kadhari, not exactly. Of what then? Of being wrong, she said. Of having made the case to the council, of having brought those ships and those people out here, and of being wrong. Of arriving too late or not being enough or having miscalculated something fundamental. A pause. Fear of failure is different from fear of dying. It sits differently. And now? She looked at me, tired eyes but clear ones. Now I'm afraid of what comes next, she said, which is different again, because what comes next is longer and harder than a battle. What comes next is making sure this doesn't happen again, to you or to anyone else. Do you think you can? I think we have to try, she said. I think that's the point. The Kadhari fleet withdrew from our system on day 22. Not in defeat. I want to be honest about what this was and what it wasn't. The Kadhari withdrawal was not a surrender. It was a reassessment. They had encountered something they hadn't calculated for, and the Kadhari, whatever else they were not irrational. They recalibrated. What the talks had produced, and this I learned over the following months as more details became public, was not a peace treaty. Not yet. What it produced was a pause, a framework for conversation, a channel. It wasn't enough. It was a start. The human fleet stayed in our system for another 3 months, while we began the long, slow work of rebuilding. Thessavar was whole, but damaged. The rest of the planet was in various states of what I can only call aftermath. The cities that had fallen needed assessment. The infrastructure that had been deliberately destroyed needed to be mapped and eventually rebuilt. The social and psychological damage that you can't see on a map needed to be acknowledged and addressed. None of that was fast, none of it was clean. But something had changed. I went back to work, obviously. Water recyclers don't maintain themselves. Supply chains need coordination. In some ways, the months after the battle were more complex logistically than the siege itself had been, because the siege had a terrible simplicity to it: survive, while the aftermath had 1,000 competing priorities and limited resources and an enormous amount of need. I worked with Petra's team throughout the first 2 months of human presence. We built something functional together, a genuine collaboration, with all the friction and miscommunication that comes from two species who think differently about time management and documentation and what counts as an emergency. There were days it was exhausting. There were days it was genuinely funny, in the dark way that exhausting collaboration sometimes becomes funny. On one of those days, I think it was week 6, I was in the middle of a particularly complicated cross-referencing problem with the water purification chemical supply when Petra came in and put a datapad on my desk. "What is this?" I asked. "Communication from the council," she said. "Well, from Yena's office, technically." I picked it up. Read it. It was a formal citation for contribution to the survival of Thessavar. My name was on it, and a few hundred other names, every sector logistics coordinator, every supply chain manager, every person who had kept the essential systems running through 8 months of siege. I looked at it for a long time. "You okay?" Petra asked. "Yes," I said. I stopped, tried to find the word. "I was doing my job." "I know," she said. "I wasn't doing anything special. I was counting supply crates. I was scheduling maintenance." "I know," she said again. "That's why you're on the list." I thought about that for a moment. "Is this a human thing?" I asked, citing the logistics people. She smiled. Varro insisted. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, she said that battles are won by the people who show up with weapons, but they're survived by the people who show up with water. I set the datapad down. Outside the distribution hub's narrow window, autumn had turned. The sky was a different shade now, cleaner, the atmospheric disturbance from the bombardment fully dispersed. Winter was coming, cold and clear and real. Thessavar was still here. We were still here. The human fleet left in the 3rd month. Not all at once. They staged their withdrawal carefully, maintaining defensive coverage until they were confident that the Kadhari weren't going to immediately return. The last ships departed on a morning in early winter, and we gathered in the observation posts and on rooftops to watch them go. There was something bittersweet about it. You get used to people. Even people who are not your people, even people from a different world who hum at memorials and laugh too loudly and spend 3 hours retrieving a box that means everything to a family they'd never met before. You get used to them. Admiral Varro sent a final transmission before the fleet jumped, short, as was her style. She said, "Thessavar is not alone. You never were, you just didn't know we were watching." She paused. "We'll keep watching." That was 8 months ago. The talks with the Kadhari are ongoing. They're slow and complicated, and there are setbacks. There are days when the news is discouraging and the path forward seems genuinely unclear. The rebuilding continues. There are sectors of Thessavar that still don't have full power. There are communities across the planet that are in the early stages of returning to their homes, finding what's left, beginning the long, uncertain work of making things livable again. None of this is over. I want to be clear about that because sometimes when you tell a story like this, it gets shaped into a neater thing than it is. The battle becomes the ending. The humans arrive, the Kadhari withdraw, credits roll. And then someone asks what happened next, and the answer is a lot, a great deal, most of it unglamorous, most of it slow. That's the part nobody sings about, the part after. The counting of costs, the long rebuilding, the careful work of making something that broke start to function again. That's also the part I do. I'm still counting supply crates. I'm still scheduling maintenance cycles. I'm still making sure 4 million people have clean water on a predictable schedule. Some days that feel small. Most days it feels like enough. A few weeks ago, I received a personal message from Petra Halst, who had returned to the Terran fleet after the withdrawal and was apparently somewhere in the outer sectors doing what logistics officers do, which is coordinate things and solve problems and drink approximately coffee. Her message was brief, updating me on the polymer compound supply replenishment she'd promised before departure, asking about the water recycler status in Sector 7, which had given us both headaches for most of November. At the end, she wrote, Admiral V sends her regards. She's been following the reconstruction reports. She says keep going. I wrote back. I gave her the recycler status. I asked about the outer sectors. At the end, I wrote, tell her Thessavar is still here. Because it is. We are. I'll end with this. After the battle, after the memorials and the talks and the slow return to whatever normal looks like after something like this, someone asked me what I thought had really saved us. They meant, was it the weapons, the tactics, the particular genius of Admiral Varro's battle plan, which every military analyst in the galaxy was apparently now studying with great attention? I thought about it, and I thought about Arvid's face opening like a door when he heard a signal from outside the system. I thought about Tress holding her colleague's hand in the dark. I thought about 200 humans standing at the edge of a memorial plaza and humming, because silence wasn't enough, and words weren't enough, and sound was what they had to offer. I thought about Petra saying, she said, if we build ships and fill them with weapons and train soldiers and go out into the galaxy, and we can't find it in ourselves to use any of that when someone needs it, what exactly were we building all of it for? I thought about a woman standing on a roof in the early morning, holding something approximately coffee, saying we have to try. That's the point. I said, I think what saved us was that someone decided we were worth saving. And then I went back to work. Because the water recyclers don't maintain themselves. And we are still here.